Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts.
All right, everybody, so glad to have you back. Here we are in this next version of this Sports Psych Concepts lecture series. Yes, I'm Dr. Colin Fehr. Glad to have you with me for sure. Want to talk about some very important concepts in sports psychology. Without this, it really wouldn't be a complete discussion. And the topic, of course, is motivation. You could spend an entire lecture series on its own of just motivation, and here you get one little snapshot presentation of it. So really a lot of directions that we could go with this, so I'm just going to give my little cross section of it, so know that there is a lot more, but we'll touch on the basics of motivation, hit on this idea of motivational climate, right? How do we create that sort of motivational or mastery climate? Essentially, how do we create a climate that optimizes motivation for our athletes and who we're working with? So within that context, there's this topic called goal orientation or achievement goal orientation. Really important to have an understanding of that to work in the field. And then there's many different theories of motivation out there. One of my favorites is self-determination theory. And so I'm going to hone in on that one a little bit, but know that there's others out there that you could explore to have a more well-rounded understanding of this. Also going to talk about in relation to the motivational climate, this is really important for coaches and applied practitioners, is something called the self-fulfilling prophecy, and how the environment that we create as coaches in particular can lead to those self-fulfilling prophecies. And then I'll end with some pro tips, right? Always good to have some of those when we're looking at how do we create this climate. So with that, let's jump into the first little idea here. And this first concept is the motivational climate itself, which I alluded to. And motivation overall, a thing to understand is it's really multifaceted. It's not sort of this unidimensional thing. Many practitioners would say that it's bidimensional. You have sort of this intensity and direction of effort, these two different pieces to it, but it's really determined by some of the psychological traits within each athlete, okay? So that's part of it, but then also the environment. So there's two ways we can look at it is all right, well, there's something inherent within the athlete that they bring with them that's psychologically, but then the environment that they're operating within has some, and how they interpret those situations has some influence on their motivation as well. So we're going to mostly focus on the environmental pieces if we're talking about motivational climate. And again, as coaches and practitioners, how do we create that? So the motivational climate itself, it really has to do with how the athletes perceive their practice environment or their competition environment, and what is emphasized there. Okay, so what are the goals? What is it that coaches are talking about with that environment? Are we mostly focusing on winning? Are we focusing on performance improvement, excellence? What is the focus? That's going to influence the motivation. And so we generally break it down into two different dimensions, which I'll go into more detail here in a moment. Is we can have more of a task-oriented motivational climate or an ego-oriented motivational climate. And that can influence the athletes, especially how they perceive those things, is what's important, which will affect their motivation. So the environment or the motivational climate that's created can contribute to the athlete's goal orientation. Okay, so which is their goal orientation is more individual or personality based, that part of it, and then the goal involvement is more of a psychological state. So a couple of different constructs to understand within this whole idea of motivational climate. So with that in mind now, let's look more closely at this goal orientation idea. So we have this task orientation dimension, and we have this ego orientation dimension, and really an athlete's overall goal orientation will lie somewhere on these two dimensions, and it fluctuates constantly. So it's really not, many times people sort of look at this as if it's absolute and it's not changing, right? It's static, when in reality it's very dynamic. But where an athlete falls on this continuum for some particular situation, or even globally across the different pursuits, will be dependent on the athlete itself, right? The things that they bring, the task itself, the nature of it, and the context. Okay, so all of these things contribute to an athlete's goal orientation, which then influences their goal involvement, which I talked about previously. So task involved athletes, right, they have more of an emphasis on gaining skills and knowledge, providing their best effort, self-improvement. That's more of the focus there. It's on the task. Sometimes you hear the term mastery, right? It's a mastery orientation. I want to get better at whatever this, I want to perfect this particular movement. I want to master the skill. I want to master the task. Okay, so task involved athletes, sometimes you see that interchangeably with mastery involved or mastery orientation, whereas ego oriented or ego involved athletes, there's more of an emphasis on winning. I want to know who the best is. I want to beat others. I want to prove how good that I am. So the focus is more, it's more ego focused. It's based on comparison to others rather than a comparison to the self, and or just trying to master whatever the skill is. So whatever an athlete's orientation is, it's going to impact a lot of different things. That's a key takeaway. Is that it's going to influence their performance, their participation, their thoughts, emotions, their actions, right? So an athlete who has high task orientation, they tend to believe that effort and training are the things that determine success and improvement, right? So they believe that ability can be changed. Another concept out there in the world you might be familiar with is a growth mindset, right? Task-oriented athletes tend to have a growth mindset. So there tends to be more intrinsic motivation, confidence, greater persistence in the face of failure, whereas an ego orientation athlete, the belief is more that ability or talent is innate and it's unchangeable. And so it's really important to put out the perspective that I'm talented, more importantly to protect my ego rather than, okay, well, I made some mistakes and I'm working to improve and I can get better. So we want to put out this face that we have the talent. So usually you see higher anxiety, lower intrinsic motivation in these athletes, or there's boredom if there's no competition stakes on the line, right? So you think this, sometimes you can just see this in a friendly gathering, social gathering. We're going to play spike ball, or we're going to play badminton or croquet or horseshoes, whatever, all these different things. And you have the one person there that always wants to, well, let's like put some money on it. Let's play a game. Let's compete. Let's keep score, right? And someone who wants to have that component there always, with regardless of what it is. And that can be a sign that maybe there's ego orientation. Okay, it's really all about how their ability is perceived by others, and if they're not superior, if they're not a winner, then oftentimes they view themselves as a failure overall. Okay, so important to understand that. So athletes can have high task, high ego orientation. They can have low task, low ego orientation. It's a spectrum. So every athlete's going to have components of both. And importantly, I'll mention this is a key takeaway for this idea, is that the best athletes often have high task and high ego orientation. Like they're really interested in mastery and improving their craft, but they also do want to win. They want to compete. They want to compare themselves to others. But it's essential to understand that's usually couched with that's feedback for them to try and improve themselves, right? That overall mastery. So that high ego orientation is there as a way to feed into this mastery thing. It's feedback. It's information. Okay, so athletes can rank on any of these dimensions on varying levels, and that can change depending on the context as well. So to extend this idea now, we need to understand how this fits in with the motivational climate, right? The climate matters. So a task-involved climate, where that's the focus, the coach puts the focus on, well, we're going to improve these skills, mastery is essential, we're going to get as good as we possibly can relative to where we were when we started. That's more of a task-involved climate. It's linked with more enjoyment, higher perceived ability, right? Because the focus is on individual improvement, better coping with sport demands, and greater team cohesion. You compare that with an ego-involved climate, where the focus is on comparison, on keeping score, on winning, right? And again, not to say that there can't be some focus on that as long as it's balanced and used as feedback within an overarching task-involved climate. But if that tends to override the task involvement, then can lead to higher anxiety, more worry over how we're performing, right? More burnout and attrition, which is not good. We don't want, especially at youth sports, we don't want kids dropping out. We want them to continue to get all those different benefits, but a lot of kids do because the coach is just all about winning, right? You see that with very young kids, right? That's the emphasis. There's actually some funny YouTube videos out there you can look up that kind of make satire about that. But we see less cohesion, more peer conflict, more self-handicapping, right? So making excuses for poor performance. So the environment, the climate that the athletes show up to really does matter quite a bit on what it is that we're emphasizing. And a lot of coaches don't really think about this too much. And you've seen this, I've seen this a lot actually within college level programs, for sure, where coaches are all about athletes competing with each other. Come here and we're going to compete and we're going to learn how to compete. And so that emphasizes that whole self-comparison thing. It's where instead of we're on a team and we need to cooperate, and obviously you need to learn how to compete, right? So it's not that you don't want to do those things. I have plenty of coaches who be like, well, isn't that important? Like, yeah, it's important, right? It's just we've got to frame that within the proper sort of perspective to make sure that that doesn't override what it is we're trying to do, the things that we can control, so we don't have some of those negative outcomes if everything is ego oriented. So how do we create that environment, of course, is the question. And again, many philosophies out there on this, so I'll just touch on the sort of, we'll call these elements of behavior control, okay, more of a behavioristic perspective perhaps, but there's lots of other different philosophies that we could bring in, but essentially consequences are important, okay? What happens after an athlete exhibits a particular behavior is going to influence their motivation, right, to continue to do that, or it's gonna influence the environment as a whole. Okay, so that's the important thing to understand, is how we implement consequences, whatever it is that happens, is important. So you have these different models out there, right, that come from different theorists in psychology, right? So you have this ABCs of behavioral control, this idea where basically there's these if-then contingencies. If this happens, then we're going to do this. So if there's a positive response to a particular behavior, if there's a positive consequence, right, then that behavior is going to be more likely to occur. If there's a negative response to a particular behavior, then it's going to make it less likely to occur. So that's the idea, right? You have these ABCs as well. There's an antecedent, something that precedes a behavior, then the behavior happens, and then there's consequences. And so different ways that we can create the environment, really with antecedents or consequences. But that's the idea, okay? Consequences matter. And so we have either this positive approach or a negative approach to creating the type of environment that we want, okay? So the positive approach is really we're using reinforcement to strengthen the particular behaviors that it is that we want, right? So that's what reinforcement is. We're increasing the likelihood that it's going to occur again based on what happened after that. Again, lots of classic experiments that helped us understand that. But if an athlete does something and then a coach comes in and provides some praise, some positive encouragement after that, that's going to reinforce that behavior, make it more likely to happen again. But reinforcement can also be there can be negative reinforcement, right? Okay, if you do this, then we're going to take away however many lines you have to run at the end of practice, right? It's kind of a common thing. Well, we're not going to condition as much, which again is like, well, why would you do that? You need to condition. So different perspectives on that as well. Okay, but that's the positive approach, whereas or one aspect of it. The negative approach is more like, well, we're going to use, instead of introducing something positive, a positive consequence, we're going to introduce something negative, okay, to influence behavior. We're going to punish, right? If you make a certain number of mistakes in this opening drill, then we're going to run lines. We're going to condition, do this sort of thing. We got to do push-ups, whatever, all the different things that are used out there to decrease the likelihood that that behavior occurs because we introduced an aversive stimulus. Okay, so that's the idea here, and punishment works, right? It works. It can weaken the behavior, making it less likely that it's going to occur again. Okay, so contrast that again with the positive approach, where we're really trying to use that praise and encouragement and to focus on learning. So even if athletes make mistakes, sometimes you see this. I've been to a lot of youth sport practices and I'll watch how athletes respond. They make a mistake, they know they made a mistake, and then they'll kind of look to their coach, and sometimes if they're used to getting more of a negative response, they'll almost like cower and wince before it even happens because they know it's going to come. So there's certainly not as much emphasis on learning from those mistakes. But the positive approach, that's what it's all about, right? You reinforce, hey, go ahead and make some mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn. That's how we get better. I've learned so much from my mistakes. I think I'll make a few more, right? A fun quote that I like to state. So then contrast that again with the negative approach. There's more of a reliance on fear. So you see those athletes like, oh man, I really don't want to mess up because then coach is going to take me out and I'm not going to get to play, or coach is going to yell at me because I made that mistake because I flubbed up, right? Whatever it is, that's quite a contrast. Okay, again, for the positive approach, athletes feel more supported. There's a lot of negative side effects to the negative approach, right? So there's this fear of failure idea, right? That almost actually it leads to, sometimes athletes have a fear of success, okay? Because then they have to, it's like, oh man, if I succeed, they'll like self-sabotage themselves. If I succeed, then I have to uphold that image, right? So there's some ego involvement there. I have to uphold that image, but then if I don't uphold that image, then I really don't want to deal with the downfall on the other side. So it's like one step removed from fear of failure, but that can lead to choking, right? You have so much emphasis on, in your mind, we're fixated on the failure, on what it is we don't want to have happen, that then it happens. So like alluding already to the self-fulfilling prophecy, not a great thing, right? But it's an unpleasant environment. Coaches are yelling, screaming, whatever. If they're using that, like, yeah, that can be motivating in the short term. Some athletes don't actually mind that too much, right? But we got to cater to that approach to the individual. So you can actually have some success with this. But usually the team will hate the coach, and so then they rally around that. We have team cohesion because, well, it all sucks together. We all hate the coach together, so we're going to rally and we're going to overcome it. So it's like that's certainly not the ideal. Okay, whereas in the positive environment, we preserve the relationships, so we don't have to lose that. Okay, but it's important to acknowledge that success is possible with that negative approach. We can go in and we can punish and we can mold behavior that way, but there are certainly some downfalls that we need to acknowledge along the way. So now let's shift our focus to this self-determination theory idea that I mentioned at the beginning as one of the theories of motivation that I really like, because it's pretty easy to grasp and wrap our minds around it, and I think there's a lot of really good application in most any setting. Okay, so this self-determination theory developed by DC and Ryan. So basically the general idea is that we are all motivated to satisfy three basic needs in any different situation. So how those needs are fulfilled at any given time, it will lead to a continuum of motivation. Okay, that's the idea. So there's this different continuum of motivation where on one end of the continuum we have a motivation, we're just lacking motivation. Maybe we go through the motions, we don't really feel confident, we don't really care, and then we have the full other end of the spectrum, which is intrinsic motivation. That's the holy grail. That's what we desire, where it's just participating in the activity for the sake of doing the activity because it provides knowledge, it's intellectually stimulating, it's fun, right? There's some achievement that comes out of it. We do it for the activity's sake itself. It's intrinsically motivating. Okay, so there's the two ends of the spectrum. So we can fall in between this on these different levels of extrinsic motivation. Okay, and most of this depends on how much, so those three basic needs, I call this the CAR, the C-A-R, every athlete needs. So the C is competence, A is autonomy, R is relatedness. We need to feel competent to some degree in what it is that we're doing. We have some belief that we can actually achieve the tasks that are set before us. We want to have autonomy, we have some sense of choice or independence in what happens to us in our life and what it is that we're doing. And we want to feel that sense of belonging. That's the relatedness, that connection with others along the way. So those three basic needs, and the more that those are fulfilled, the more self-determined our motivation is, right? Internally self-determined. And autonomy tends to be a key part of that. Okay, so we have this whole range where it can be external regulation was like, well, I ought to do something, right? I'm doing this because I want to get a reward. Then we have introjected regulation when we feel there's some sort of internal prods or pressures to do something, which could be, well, I'm doing this just because I want to impress my dad, or I'm eating salad because I know that it's good for me. Okay, then there's this threshold of autonomy after that where the behavior becomes a little bit more intrinsic, right? It's still technically extrinsic, but now we want, instead of, well, we ought to do the activity, now I want to do it. So identified regulation is the first part of that, where it's the behavior itself is highly valued and accepted by the athlete, by the individual, and it's performed willingly, right? Even if the activity itself isn't enjoyable. So this is the conditioning example, or say, I'm an athlete and it's really cold outside where I live, so I'm going to go do my training on a treadmill. Like, well, maybe I don't really enjoy that very much, but I know that exercise itself is important and I want to do that. Okay, so that's identified regulation. I identify something valuable about it. Then we have integrated regulation, where the activity itself now becomes personally important because of some valued outcome. Okay, so rather than intrinsic values like the activity itself for the sake of doing it, makes it intrinsic. Most athletes do conditioning more on this principle, actually, integrated regulation, where it's personally important to me because of something that I am trying to achieve myself. Okay, so it helps me move toward my goal. So the application of this, right? Practitioners, coaches, we're working with athletes. A lot of application in athletes who are recovering from injury, for sure, with this, trying to attend to these three different needs. But coaches can support autonomy. Practitioners can by asking the athlete for input, right? So remember I said that autonomy piece is big. Ask them for input. Allow them to have choices where it makes sense for them to have choices. Really explain the why. A very prominent coach in my development over the years explained that to me very early on in my career. If you can explain the why, you're going to get a lot more buy-in. You're going to support that autonomy. They're going to understand it and think, okay, now I understand why. It's not just because you're saying just because. I got to understand why, so now I can choose to buy into that why, that idea. Okay, and then last, we want to focus on intrinsic rewards. Okay, so and use those extrinsic rewards strategically. Okay, so it's the extrinsic reward if we're giving out a team t-shirt for accomplishing a certain goal, or they're getting sticker stars, or whatever it is we're using. We need to make sure that they understand that reward is information about their competence, right? That supports their autonomy and their intrinsic motivation. So we need to frame it in the right perspective for that to be the most useful. So moving on now to this idea of self-fulfilling prophecies that I touched on briefly. And essentially it's expecting something to happen, and it actually when we expect it to happen, it actually helps cause it to happen. Okay, so this can lead to a vicious cycle if it's negative. I talk to tennis players about this all the time. It's okay, well, you're about to hit your second serve on match point, and you're sitting there telling yourself, don't double fault, don't double fault, don't double fault. You toss that ball up in the air, smack. You hit it right into the net cord, and you double fault, right? It happened. You're fixated on it, then it happened because you were spending all that time thinking about what it is you didn't want to have happen. So this can lead itself, we have negative expectations, can lead to failure, then there's a lower self-image and confidence, well, then it increases the likelihood of future failure. So that's that nasty sort of cycle that athletes can get pulled into. And then coaches really play an important role in this, because the expectations or the judgments that coaches put on athletes can be influential in the athlete's subsequent behavior or performance. So there's something out there called this expectation performance model, right? This idea of whatever the expectations are that a coach places on an athlete, then an athlete, and it can be based on an observation. Okay, so you have tryouts, you never watched the athlete before, they have tryouts, whatever it is they bring with them on that first day, you watch, and then you build an expectation around whatever it is that you observed the first time. And so maybe they had an off day, maybe they came and they were sick, maybe there was something going on in their personal life where they didn't perform as well. And so then the coach forms an expectation around that then affects their behavior toward that athlete, which then reinforces the behavior, making it more likely to occur, and then subsequently reinforces again the coach's expectation of that, right? So you can another term for this is like pigeonholing athletes. It's like, no, you don't shoot the three ball, you don't play defense, you just play offense, right? We put these expectations, we pigeonhole athletes. So then, yeah, that's who they are. It's like it becomes part of their identity, and it's this self-fulfilling prophecy. And I was like, see, I told you. It's like, yeah, because you built that. Like, you built that psychological construct and put that athlete in the box, and then they lived up to that expectation, right? Expectation, performance, process. So we have to be aware of that to where we keep that open-ended, whatever the expectation is. Like, yeah, you could do this if you wanted to do this. Maybe this is where your strengths are right now, but you keep that open. So then, and you'll hear athletes, they have this ingrained in them. I've had athletes that come and they talk to me, and I'm like, holy cow, like you've had this built into you. Like you're only a three-point shooter. You don't drive into the lane and shoot inside. And athletes struggle with that. It's like, well, but I kind of know I can do that, but coach says like this is all I can do, and all this, it's really hard, and it can mess with athletes. So this also can go in the positive direction. So Roger Bannister, when he broke the 4-minute mile record, right, he saw that within his own mind. So you can bring in the power of visualization or imagery with respect to this, right? No great athlete who ever achieved something great, who broke a world record, didn't first do it in their own mind. So we can use this self-fulfilling prophecy for our benefit. And I think that's a very powerful tool. So coaches, again, right, some pro tips for coaches, that first impressions are not always correct. So that athlete can come on that first day of practice at tryouts, not so good. Don't put that expectation on the next day. They can change. They're moldable, right? And we want them to change and improve. We don't want them to stay the same. So we need to demonstrate what's called that perceptual flexibility. So we can change our expectations of an athlete when they give us good reasons to do that, right? Other behaviors demonstrated, all right, I ditched that other idea. I was way off on that. Okay, and we need to understand the effects, if we're working with youth athletes, of maturation. Okay, so some athletes have gorilla arms or whatever, how it is, or all limbs and no torso, then they grow out of that and it changes, and then all of a sudden they're this different athlete. Like that can have an effect. So we really don't want to pigeonhole into those things. We also need to be aware of sports stereotypes, right, related to gender, ethnicity, academics, socioeconomic status, whatever, all these different things that can factor into this. We don't want to pigeonhole people based on those, whatever their group identity is, the group that they come from, okay, because then that can lead to this in a negative direction. So this is a powerful topic, and it fits nicely into this motivational climate that we're trying to create, for sure, because it can certainly be defeating for athletes' motivation, but if we use it in that positive direction, like you need to believe that you can become what it is you want to become, and then it happens, then that can really stoke the fires of motivation. So now, lastly, I want to end with just some general pro tips that are some key takeaways from this. We're trying to, how do we create that mastery, motivational climate? What is our emphasis? So the first one is, well, we need to determine what the source of information is that we're using to form our preseason and early season expectations. So what are we basing that off of? So here's an example that I get often is, if many times when I work with a youth athlete, say high school level athlete, the first bits of information I get come from the parent. So I'll have a conversation with the parent and they kind of walk me through and they describe what they think the issue is. And so I take that and kind of note that, but it's important that when the athlete comes and talks to me, it's a blank slate, completely open to what it is that they present. And what I've discovered with that is oftentimes it's like, no, actually the issue is with you, Dad. It's not with what you think that it is. And then they're not keeping their eye on the ball. It's like you're putting way too much pressure on them and that's suffocating the kid. And that's really what's going on. So we have to be open to those things early on. However it is, the athlete comes and presents itself. We don't want to back them into a corner. Okay? So consider those sources of information that we're using. We also need to realize that our initial assessments of an athlete's competence may not be totally accurate, and we need to revise those continuously, okay? Because competence should change. If athletes come and they practice and they're working on things, it should change, it should improve. So we should be assessing that on the fly, on the go. And we should keep a running count, right, of the amount of time that athletes spend on non-skill related activities. Okay, so we need to acknowledge those things that they're doing outside of whatever it is that we think that they may be doing and give them credit for those things. That can be incredibly motivating to find those things. Hey, maybe you're not quite getting this skill down here, but man, you're doing all this stuff over here, and I want to acknowledge that. We should certainly design instructional activities or drills that provide all our athletes with an opportunity to improve their skills. So that's like a basic thing. Yeah, we should do that. We should design practices in a way where everybody can get better. That's going to build a stronger motivational climate and a place where athletes want to be. Okay, and that's really, it's like, man, what's motivation? What can coaches do to motivation? Create the environment where athletes want to be. And that's going to get the job done for you. And we should respond to errors with corrective instruction, right? It shouldn't be punitive. It shouldn't be overly critical. It should be constructive, corrective instruction. Hey, all these different techniques on how to provide feedback, and we need to make sure that we provide that in the most effective manner. Acknowledging the things that went well, saying, hey, we need more of those things. Keep working at it. You're going to get it. Classic. And then we need to emphasize skill improvement, right? This is the key. This is what we're looking at. This is how we're going to evaluate and reinforce individual athletes, is how are we tracking whether we're actually getting better ourselves. And this is why you look at like, okay, well, most improved athlete, a lot of athletes really value that a lot. At the end of the season banquet and award ceremonies that we have, an athlete gets the most improved award. Like that's a significant award because they came the far. Hey, maybe you still weren't the best. This person was our MVP, but man, you came the farthest, and that's cool. It's like everybody should get a most improved, or at least have their improvement acknowledged. And then you want to interact frequently with all the athletes on the team, right? So you want to solicit information from them to understand what it is that they're experiencing and what they're going through and how practices are. Okay, because then it's going to give you a sense of, well, how am I creating that motivational climate? Am I doing that? How do I know? We need to solicit and ask for feedback. And overall, if we do these things, we adhere to these pro tips, we're going to create that mastery-oriented climate in our practices, which is what we want. We want maximum motivation. I've talked to a lot of coaches where they say that. It's like, what do coaches do? They motivate. Okay, how do we motivate? We create mastery-oriented climates in our practices. So in review, because we made it through all the things, we talked about a lot of different things that I hopefully you found were helpful. We touched on the basics of motivation, pieces that play into that: direction and intensity of effort, the motivational climate, that space that we're creating, goal orientation. Really important to understand that concept of where it's task and ego dimensions and how athletes can fall on different spectrums of that. Self-determination theory, how do we provide or meet those three basic psychological needs of competency, autonomy, and relatedness. Remember, it's the car every athlete needs. And then self-fulfilling prophecy was the last main idea that we talked about in that expectation performance process and cycle that athletes can get in if coaches don't have that awareness and they create that. So hopefully the pro tips were helpful for you. Hopefully this presentation was useful. I enjoyed doing them, so thanks for listening to this point, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify, or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.